And we went through when we learned together in the learner service. We really went through all of the services and talked about different minhagim, which are traditions, and different halachot, which are Jewish law, right, which are more legally based in different parts of the service. But now we're going to take a more specific look at specific pieces of our liturgy. So for example, this morning we're going to look at why do we bow, and we're going to look at sort of across particularly the morning liturgy, but across our liturgy, and see why we bow in certain places. And if you have questions or topic suggestions, I should say, you should let me know. We're going to do this for about 6 weeks, and I have some of my own ideas, but if there are things that you have questions about that you think could be a full class, a full topic, I'm happy to take those on. And the last thing I'll say is that I know that I said this will end at 9, and I will be true to my time because I know that people have other commitments. So we're going to be short and sweet, and we're going to get through, I think, a lot of material. I told Gary I maybe overdid it, but we'll see how we do. So this morning we're going to talk all about bows. For those of you who take my Mishnah class, this is how I usually do this. I usually share my screen so we can all be on the same page with a source sheet. And the first place I want to start is I want to start in our Tanakh. I want to start with some Torah verses. First of all, it's important to understand, or to at least think about the different words that we have in our tradition for the word bow. And once we understand the different words that we have for the word bow, we might come to understand, and I say we might because you're going to see it's not always so crystal clear. We might come to understand why we bow in the different places that we do. I just want to say, if you have a Siddur, it would be helpful to have it near you, but I do have most of the sources here so that we can follow along. So the first source here, Vayisa Einav Vayar Vehine Shlosha Anashim, looking up. This is at the very beginning of Breshit, when Avraham is in his tent and he looks up and he sees the 3 guests standing there. Maybe they were angels or 3 men. It's, so the commentaries are a little unclear. So it says Abraham looks up and he sees 3 men standing there. And as soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance to greet them, bowing to the ground. Vayishtachu, okay? This is a very common root of the word bow in the Torah. Shin, chet, hey. You can see that I translated it there for the first time, but it's going to come up again. Shin, chet, hey. If you have like a grammar book, I'm sure some of you do. If you have some sort of an app that you can find the root words on certain words, you can look it up and you'll get a completely unclear answer. It's not helpful at all, right? To bend over, to stoop low, to bow down. There's some indication that we are, putting our head forward, putting our body forward, and going and bowing down in some sort of submission, not necessarily to the ground. So we'll come back to that. Breshit, I'm just going to move through these pretty quickly. If you have a question, like always, raise your hand or unmute yourself. Breshit, when Yaakov and Esau reunite with one another, Jacob, he bows 7 times. He himself went on ahead and bowed low to the ground, Vayishtachavu. So here it says Vayishtachavu, same root. It says that he bowed, but then it says artza, right? He actually bowed all the way to the ground. So if you're going to use reasoning, if you're going to use logic, and you're going to put those 2 roots together, and you see that they're the same, you know that the first one, if they had meant going all the way to the ground, they would have had to say that, if that makes sense, right? So now we sort of have to pull them apart. One says Vayishtachu, the other one says Vayishtachu artza. So that's just a little bit of a framing. And then the last verse that I wanted to bring us, which if you were to Google, which I did, bowing in Judaism, just to see what was out there, right? This is the verse that comes up most often, which is interesting because this is not a verse that we read quite often. It's in the writings. The book of Daniel's in the writings. But this idea that Daniel really had to submit himself to God, and it uses the word barech. And we know that the root barech is also in the word baruch, right? To bless. Perhaps it also means knees, like your birkaim, right? Barech, meaning your knees. And so the idea here, at least, the way that it's understood, is that he went all the way down. He put his knees all the way to the ground. It says 3 times a day he kneeled upon his knees. But again, barech al birchohi, right? It actually says he went down on his knees. So again, you kind of have to use the context and to understand what kind of a bow are we actually talking about. Question, Sandy.
Well, doesn't this relate to Catholics who kneel?
So
part of their, prayer.
Yeah, definitely in other traditions, there's a lot more, there's kneeling in prayer. This particular one, it could, but it also definitely relates to what we know is what we see on the high holidays. We imagine that a lot of bowing sort of back a long time ago in our tradition actually was full prostration, a lot of it, and we've come out of that. So now we know that we really only do that on Yom Kippur. But yes, there's definitely reference to other religions definitely kneel when and also fully prostrate, right? In Muslim tradition, they go all the way down to the ground with their head all the way. So here, these are just two root words that we find in our Tanakh. And then we're going to see one more. So now we're going to move on to the Talmud. Are there any questions just based on what? Yeah, Stuart.
Yeah, I was, it's a long time ago, but when I went to Hebrew school, I was told that Judaism was different than Christianity, and that people didn't kneel because it was like to kneel would be to bow down to idols. So was that a special case in Daniel's case?
So we've evolved, I would say, is what happened. So if we don't actually know, right? But the commentators tell us, and our literature tells us that kneeling was probably what happened back in the time of the Torah. And since then, we don't kneel, like you said, because we don't want to appear like we're bowing down to idols. So we've evolved out of that. And certainly, like I said, other traditions do kneel, and we find ourselves not doing that very often. And we're going to see why actually in a little bit. So here are some pieces from the Talmud also to expand our vocabulary a little bit and give us some more root words. So it says, Va'amar Rabba bar Chanina, and I'll mostly just read in English. And Rabba bar Chanina, Sava, said in the name of Rav, one who is praying when he bows in the appropriate places, he bows when he says Baruch, right? Korea, see, I highlighted it for you. Korea, bebaruch. He bows when he says bless. And when he subsequently stands up, he stands upright when he says God's name. So that might be something that you're familiar with, right? That when you bow over, you're submissive in the word Baruch, but you always want to be standing. I know we talked about this in the learner service. You always want to be fully upright when you say God's name. So if you're thinking about the choreography of that, you sort of come down, Baruch, Atah, and then you come back up on the word Adonai. Shmuel, who was Rav's colleague, says, what is Rav's reasoning for this? And he quotes from Psalms, and he said, God who raises the bowed, right? So we know that when we say the word God, when we're referring to God, we want to be standing fully upright. And that is really a proof text in our Gemara, in our Talmud, to help us understand when we're supposed to, put our body forward and when we're supposed to be standing straight. And then the Talmud uses this verb again, shocheh, which we saw before. Tanu Rabbanan Elu Barachot She'adam Shocheh Bahem. The sages taught in the Tosefta, these are the blessings in the Amidah in which a person bows. So first he says, in the first blessing and the blessings of the patriarch, one bows at the beginning and at the end. So just to give us a little bit of context, I always have trouble making this big in Safaria. Okay. Okay, so here's the beginning of the Amidah, Adonai Sfatai Tiftach, Ufi Agit Elatecha, and here's our first Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu, right? So Baruch, you would go, you would bend your knee. Then on Atah, you would be standing up. So Baruch, you would go to your knee. Then Atah, you would put your body forward, and then you would find yourself back upright by the time you say the word Adonai. Then you daven that paragraph standing. And then what it means when it says the end of that blessing is right here, okay? Baruch Atah Adonai Magen Abraham. Oy, this is what happens when you do this. There we go. At the end of that paragraph, we have Baruch Atah Adonai Magen Avraham, and in our Siddur, Vezrat Sarah, right? And that same bow, Baruch with your knees bent, submissive over on the word Atah, and standing up when you say Adonai. Is that different than what anybody has learned before? Anybody heard any other customs on that? Yeah, so that's pretty widely accepted, I would say. And the reason that I say that is because once you start to read into this, which I really sort of, I had done this before a long time ago, but I really read into it this week. There's conflicting information. Interestingly, for the Amidah, it's less so, and we're gonna again see that when we look at some of these liturgies. So here we go. So we have this first blessing, the blessing where it says of the patriarchs at the beginning of the Amidah, that very opening piece of the prayer, and then that second paragraph where we don't bow is at the very end. Okay, so at the very end of the Avot. Now I've lost it because sorry. All right, I'm not going to worry about it. At the very, very end of the Amidah, there's that third bracha right before the Kedushah. We actually don't bow there. There's not a particular reason for it other than what we'll see in a little bit, which is essentially bowing too much. We don't want to bow on every single one, right? Because if we bowed on every single one, certain ones wouldn't stand out and certain ones wouldn't be special. You might hear echoes of this for those of you who are taking the Mishnah class on brachot, right? Why we don't say Shechianu all the time? Why we don't say certain brachot all the time? Because if we said them all the time, they wouldn't be special. They wouldn't be distinct. And here the Gemara is outlining these two specific bows. And then it says in the blessing of Thanksgiving, which is modim, right? Modim anachnu lach. Modim anachnu lach. You'll notice there's no baruch there. So you don't actually bend your knees. All you do is kind of bow your body like this. And at the very end of that bracha, Baruch Atah Adonai Ha'el Ha'odaot. Let's pull it out. I wish I had it on this. Hold on. I'm going to find it. I think what I'm going to do is not blow it up because that seems to be messing us up a little bit. We're close. Hold on a second.
If anyone has a weekday Siddur, the Modim is on 41, and the where Rabbi Russell's going now will be on 43.
Thank you. I just wanted to show you the end of the bracha so we can see it. Here we're close.
While you're scrolling, is there a reason? This is one that this is the one bow. I kind of got Modim Anachnu Lach because it feels like there is this special prayer. I haven't looked at the origins of that, but it feels that way. But I never totally understand why in this, Baruch Atah Adonai Hatov Shimcha Rucha Na'el Lehodot, we did a bow then. Like, what's the reason?
Well, I think according to the Gemara, and if you use the reasoning from the Gemara, it's part of the same thing, right? So you're bowing at the beginning of that section and you're bowing at the end, and both of them have to do with Thanksgiving. So they're not actually saying that they're two separate pieces. Modim actually starts that section, and similar to the very beginning, right, where Baruch Atah Adonai starts the section of the patriarchs and matriarchs, and then we end it with the patriarchs and matriarchs with another bow. We do this in the Thanksgiving piece. So we open with Modim, with like a sort of submissive like this, and then in order to close that section is when is the end bow. So I actually think it's completely related. I think it's all part of the same section.
And the other question is, I always wondered, like, why it's interesting that through all the Amidah prayers, we don't do the bows for the Baruch Atah, for those blessings, each one. Some people do it naturally, but it's not a thing.
So you mean every single bracha of the Amidah?
Of the Amidah.
Yeah, so we'll see that in a minute, but I think, what I said just a second ago is about this, like, overdoing it. Right? Like, you don't want to bow every single time. I mean, how many times do we see Baruch Atah Adonai in our liturgy, right? We see it all over the place. And if we bowed every single time, it would probably get a bit confusing. And also, I think one of the sources, I don't think I put it in here, but one of the sources said, you're just going to confuse people, because if you say you're doing your silent Amidah, right? And you have a few bows, but if you were bowing all the time, nobody would know where to do it, right? In the times of the early prayer, people learned by watching what other people were doing. In some ways, actually, we still do that, right? Some people will say, what's your tradition? What's your mincha? Well, I grew up doing this thing and I grew up doing this thing. And it's all mostly from watching what other people are doing around you, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that would, I think we'll see an actual text on why, but Gary.
I have a question. So, you know, when we do the repetition for Modim and Achnulak, we're seated. So, I mean, it's easy to do the one you lean forward and, you know, lean over. But when you do what do you do with the one Hatov when you're seated, since you can't do a full bow?
That's a great question. I mean, I would, if you were, I would lean forward. If you were going to do something, I would lean forward. I have to say, this is, I think that this is actually one that it's not, they don't talk about it in terms of the repetition. And I think the idea probably when these texts were written was that you were standing the whole time. So there wasn't necessarily, there's not necessarily text or reason for what or how you do it when you're sitting down. I think the expectation is that you're probably standing through the whole thing, because they talk about, you know, you'll notice in this Gemara, the one that they're missing, and we'll see it from the Rambam in a minute, we'll see it from Maimonides, the one that you're missing is the bow at the very end, right? When you go forward and backwards, and then you kind of do the left and the right, and you bow on your way out of the Amidah. And there's really not a whole lot of conversation around the repetition and what you would do when you're seated. Yeah, you practicing?
I was just trying to think of, I don't remember bowing at the end.
Okay. So here, do you have a question? No, Marcia's talking to somebody else. Okay. Now we're going to get into, so that was kind of a quick zip through some of the texts in our tradition, Torah and Tanakh and Gemara, Talmud. And now we're going to actually look at the pieces of our liturgy that I want to talk about. The three that I want to go through today are Aleinu, the Amidah, and Baruch Hu. What I did actually was I put them in what I thought was the order that was the most clear to the least clear. So we're going to start with the Aleinu, and you're going to see why. So Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol, latet gedula liotzer breshit. Then it says at the end of that in the middle of that paragraph, va'anachnu korim umishtachavim umodim lifnei melech melchei hamlachim. We bow down low, or in the Sim Shalom, we bend the knee and bow. So the Sim Shalom is translating this bending of the knee based on the translations that we saw above from Daniel, likely, right? Korim, they're taking this to mean that we actually are bending our knee, umishtachavim, and then we submit ourselves by moving our body forward, and then at the end of Lifnei Melech, we can stand up again. So for those of you who are sort of trying to picture this, I don't know that I can show you, but bending your knee in Va'anachnu Korim, I tried to color code it a little bit, putting your whole body forward on the orange, umishtachavim umodim, and then bringing your body up for Lifnei Melech. And the Mishnah Berurah, which is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, which is a very well respected and mostly very commonly used code of Jewish law, says the following: and we must kneel so that one will not be seen as an infidel, i.e., saying the words and we bend down in an upright position implies that one does not follow through with his words. In order to show that our actions are consistent with our beliefs, it is customary to bend over slightly while saying these words. So essentially, here in the Aleinu, it tells you exactly what to do. You don't have to wonder, do you bend or do you bow or whatever. The Aleinu is sort of giving you a very clear-cut way of doing it. Again, has anybody experienced this differently? Did anybody grow up not bending your knees or not fully going over or anything like that? Any other traditions in this room that we haven't, that's different than what I just said? Right. So the Aleinu is pretty clear cut, right? It's pretty clear about what they want you to do in this section. And mostly when you go to shuls around the world, you're going to see it this way. So that's good. We can check that one off our list. Does anybody have any questions about that one? That's kind of our easiest one. No? Okay. So the question that I want to ask at the end of every one of these pieces of liturgy is it minchag or is it halacha? Now, minchag is translated as tradition. Halacha is translated as Jewish law. It could be a little bit of both. We'll see that in the other sections. Minchag doesn't mean, though, that it's made up, right? I don't want it to feel like Jewish law is written down and it's very, very strict, and minchag is, made up however you want to do it, and it depends. But what it means, like sometimes minchag can actually become halacha. Minchag become so strong and become so strict that it becomes the custom of the community. And so in this case, I'm just curious, what do people think, minhag or halacha?
I would say this one's halacha.
Okay, why?
Because the universality, and also because of, I've always thought of it as just affirming that the source of the Aleinu comes from the Malchuyot prayers on Rosh Hashanah. So we're kind of responding to that with the bowing.
Great. So there's some sort of rootedness in text or otherwise that is making you think the Aleinu was halacha. Okay.
Yeah, I will just go on the other side of that. Just why? I don't know. Because, because it kind of feels like that category of strong minhag that became halacha. Like, I think it's really strong. It's as minhag goes, but it doesn't feel, it's not a barech, because it's not a barech, or it's not a shinchet hey kind of reasoning. It feels like, yes, they took it from the high holidays and said, well, we might as well do it here, even though we're not prostrating the whole thing and it's in a different place. So it feels like that. Yeah, it's halacha, but it really, like, its roots are in minhag.
Great. So I'm going to argue that I don't think there's an answer here. I'm going to argue that it's a little bit of both. And the reason that I'm going to say that it's a little bit of both is because the Aleinu originally was in our Siddur, and then it was taken out, and then it was put back in, right? So if it was halacha, that probably wouldn't be the case, right? That probably wouldn't have been the case. So that's the first thing. However, now that it's there, it is very clear what you're supposed to do. So I would say that it's minchag with like halachic guidelines, right? So it's a minchag that the prayer is even in our siddur, perhaps. That's my interpretation. But that the fact that you bow is quite clear. Like Gary said, it says it exactly here what you're supposed to do. Now the question is, Marilyn talked about some of the roots. We're not necessarily sure what all of these roots necessarily mean. There's different proof for all of these and how we actually can do them. Some of you might leave this class very frustrated. Like, did she teach us anything? Because you're telling me, well, it might be this, it might be that, but that really is how these texts are written. It's quite fascinating. So Aleinu, I'm going to put into a category of both as being minchag in terms of praying the Aleinu, and halacha in terms of the way that we actually use the choreography and actually bow. Okay, the Amidah. We have much more to say on the Amidah, thank goodness. So we're going to start off with a text from the Shulchan Aruch, which is similar to the text, if not exactly the same, as the text from the Gemara that says, these are the places that we bow at the beginning and at the end. It means the avot, the pieces of the patriarchs, like we said before, at Modim, at the place of thanksgiving, Modim Anachnu Lach, and then at the end of Modim Anachnu Lach, El HaOdaot, the giving thanks. And then it says there's this added piece in the Shulchan Aruch. And
can you share your screen?
Oh, yeah, I can. Thank you. Thanks for asking. I'm just reading it alone here by myself. Okay. Sorry. And if you come to bow, this is for you, Marilyn, and if you come to bow at the end of every blessing or at the beginning, we teach one not to do this. Okay? We teach him not to bow every single time because it says it's confusing, right? You're going to be doing it too much. So not only are you not supposed to do it, but if you see somebody doing it, you should go over there and stop them. Now, I'm not suggesting that any of you do that. It's not a very good practice to do that, and we know that sometimes you can make somebody feel bad. But it's all to say, not only are you not supposed to be sort of bowing in the middle, but if you are trying to teach someone else to do it, you would caution them by letting them know that bowing in the middle is not the practice.
Can I ask you about that? Because I thought it was halakha that you're not allowed to embarrass someone. So wouldn't that be embarrassing someone?
Yeah. Right. You have to sort of put your halachic values, I don't know, above and below each other. Definitely, I think that this is it's not implying that you should embarrass somebody. Rather, that you would want to teach the person maybe after the service, right? Sometimes we do that. Just to let you know, we don't actually bow at the end. We bow here, whatever. And yes, yeah, definitely you don't want to embarrass someone. In the Mishnah Torah, we have also a little bit of an extension of what we were talking about before. So the Mishnah Torah says exactly what it says above, which is here are the places, avot, beginning and end, modim, beginning and end. And then we get the, let's see, yeah, the very end piece, which is what I was talking about before. And upon completing the Amidah, one bows and takes 3 steps backwards while bowing. One takes leave from one's left and afterwards from one's right. One lifts his head up from the bowed position. And so when you're actually, when you go in, Adonai Svatai Tiftach, you take 3 steps back, you take 3 steps forward into and out of the Amidah. And in the same way, you take steps into and out of the Amidah at the very end. And this text is suggesting, maybe you've seen this before, maybe this is your own practice, that when you actually come out, you bow to the left and the right. So I'll show you. So you kind of go, you're going to go at the very end, back 3, forward 3, and then you bow to the left and you bow to the right, and then you're done. Has anybody seen that before, or is that anybody's practice? Marilyn?
Yes, except there's a lot of variations on that.
That's right. Yes.
Because I mean, I know my practice is I take my 3 steps back. And then I do the side to side, and then I do the left, the right, then I take 3 steps forward, then I do the final bow. I think that's what I do.
Yeah, in order to figure out what you really do, you'd probably have to stand up and do it, right? Because it's like all in your body and you remember it. But that is to say that this in the Mishnah Torah is one of the only places where it actually talks about that final bow because yeah, it's not mentioned in any other place, which is interesting. And they're linking the bowing to the completion of the Amidah, that very end piece where you're going in and out, which sometimes I think people forget about, or maybe most people don't bow in that place. But is to say that there is that fifth place and that final bracha at the end of Sim Shalom, where you're coming in and out. Now we have Elohai Natzor there, which is an addition, right? That we have this sort of end meditation. So you have to tweak that a little bit to fit where that bow is actually going to be. It's very clear. Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
Is there an explanation of why it's left and right rather than right and left?
Not that I know of. Do you have a thought?
Maybe.
I had one that I learned, but the weird thing about it is, so Mishneh Torah was written by Rambam, who is always saying that, we don't want to personify God. And the explanation that I was giving the angels who are up,
the angels,
to that, because in Hebrew we read from right to left, so it'd be logical to bow right to left, but we bow left to right because we're bowing to the angels right and left. But Maimonides would never accept that. So that
to say that he was bowing to the angels,
yeah, it would have me it has me confused. If that's the explanation?
Yeah, I don't know. Any other thoughts?
I was going to ask the same question. Can you say more about the angels?
Gary?
What help me? What's the text where it talks about the ark, and on the top of the ark there are angels on the right and the left, right?
Yes, I can't pull it off the top of my head either, but yeah, there you bow to the left and bow to the right, sort of acknowledging the angels. We actually talked about this a little bit yesterday in our Mishnah class because of idolatry, which is kind of what Gary was alluding to. This idea that you wouldn't really, in our liturgy today, you'd be quite careful not to actually bow towards a direction that was going to make it seem like you were bowing to some sort of an idol, which is sort of what Gary's talking about here in the Mishnah Torah, that Rambam would have certainly been careful about that. But there's the text that sort of that says that you're bowing to an angel on your right and on your left, or on your left or on your right, I guess is how it goes. Okay, so this is our final bow in the Amidah. And now we're going to talk about some technical pieces. So it says, one who is praying, one needs to bend until all the vertebrae in his spine are bent. So if you picture that, right, you could put your head to your knees, basically, right? If you can do that. I can't, but maybe some of you can. You're really bending all the way down until all the vertebrae in your back are completely over. He should not bow from his hips. His head should stay straight and submissive. So try that. I mean, you don't have to actually, but think about that, right? You're all kind of like, how does that? It's very confusing, right?
It
So
It sounds like a yoga pose.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the one where it's like the yoga pose where you're kind of like this. I don't know exactly what it's called, but this so they're giving so the Shulchan Aruch is like giving you some direction about how you're supposed to feel in your body, right? You're supposed to feel as if your whole back, like your vertebrae has allowed you to go all the way forward, and yet you don't want to actually let your head go all the way down because then maybe you've put your head down before God or something like that, right? It's a little bit confusing how they have it worded here.
Well, yeah, because it says your head should stay straight, and I would think that what that would mean is that when you bow, like they don't want you to be like the whole idea is to really keep your head in line with the rest of your body. If it's your head should stay straight and submissive, that seems like the way to go.
Great. So now that you're demonstrating, stay there. One should not bow too much until one's mouth is opposite one's belt. Okay. If one is sick or old and cannot bow, one should humble one's head. That is enough. Thank you, Marilyn. Okay.
I'm struck by the idea of straight and submissive. That almost sounds like a juxtaposition because by definition, you show submission by bowing.
Yeah, and there is definitely, sorry, the siren. It's definitely hard to put the choreography, to put the text into practice here. There's clearly, so I'm going to give away the end a little bit, right, where I'm going to ask minchag or halacha, but there's clearly there's a halacha. They're trying to establish a halacha. They're trying to establish some sort of norm around bowing, but actually putting it into words is proving to be quite difficult because different people are experiencing in different ways. If you actually allow your vertebrae to go all the way down, you'd be almost on the floor, right? Minus the fact that you haven't bent your knees. But here it sort of says, but we don't want your head to go all the way down because we want you to be, I don't know, paying attention or making sure that you're sort of still, your intention is still that you're bowing to God. Ernie, I saw your hand.
Yeah. Coming back to the Aleinu, would you comment about the different melodies that are used? Because we have some, but then sometimes we use different melodies. And is there any reason other than the preference of the person who's reciting it?
That is a great question, and I think can be asked probably for many of our prayers, right?
Right.
I definitely, so I think a lot about melody, and I think about what the words actually mean and how we use them and how we apply. So the one that always comes to mind for me is the Vishamru, and how we and how different melodies have come to be for Vishamru, which is actually celebrating Shabbat, right? That to me, it should be something that's joyful. And oftentimes there are these melodies that are written are like a dirge, and it feels to me like we should be celebrating a bit more than using melody that way. The Aleinu is just like any other. I don't know that there's. I guess the original is Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, right? And then the newer one that we've used a little bit here is I can't even remember it off the top of my head. But I guess yeah, great. So that one sort of highlighting this idea. Thank you for the choir. That one sort of highlighting this idea of ein od, of there being none other or right. So I guess it depends on the prayer leader's preference is really what it is. I'm curious though if you're asking for a reason having to do with bowing, like is that something that you're connecting melody to?
We used to do was the traditional one that you did, and then when Rabbi Glazer came,
yes,
the other one, and he seemed to have a preference for that, and was that because he was from Canada, or is it a local preference, or what is there?
So
any for it?
I'm being recorded here, Ernie, so I have to watch what I say, but. But it's just this. I think Rabbi Glazer preferred that melody because of the focus on ein od. First of all, right? This repetition of ein od, ein od, ein od. And there's also, he once taught me at the very end. This is a little off topic. The very, very end. Bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad. So the farmer in the dell always really rubbed him the wrong way. And then at the very end, you go, and it was like a trinity, that he didn't like that you said the word God 3 times in a row. So I'm now totally speaking for him, and I shouldn't, but that's a reason that he preferred the other melody, and it, I think, had nothing to do with the piece about bowing and such. It was more about the surrounding, about a note and about that very, very end.
It's just like Rabbi Lou didn't have to do that first paragraph because Yehunaten Shemayim was the itsy bitsy spider, and he
Right, yeah, that's exactly right. Right. Everybody
all.
has those things. Yes.
Rabbi Russell, a question that when you say repeating Adonai like that, that is a halakha, isn't it? I mean, I learned one time that if you repeat the name and you're a leader, you're actually supposed to be given the hook, and someone's supposed to take over.
That is true. And with 9 minutes left, we're not going to spend time on it. That's a whole class in of itself. But that's right. You're not supposed to say the word God more than once if it's not written more than once, which we actually talked about in a Mishnah. Okay. Here we go. We're going to continue with our Shulchan Aruch. When one bows, it should be once. So just to clarify, these are all in a specific section of the Shulchan Aruch about the Amidah. So we can't necessarily take these texts and apply them elsewhere, though sometimes we kind of do. But for the most part, it's about the Amidah. When one bows, it should be once and speedy. And when one straightens up, one should straighten comfortably with one's head up first after one's body, so it does not look like a burden. Again, this is all about sort of intention, right? And why are you actually using your body to bow over to God? And you don't want to look like you're struggling with it, right? And actually kind of goes back up here. It says if one is sick or old and cannot do it, one should just humble their head. Nobody should put themselves in a strained position where you're either hurting or uncomfortable or something like this. And then here we have what we've already talked about before. When he bows, bow at the word Baruch and stand up at God's name, at Hashem's name. And then our final one, when one is praying, and this is where we touched on this before, when one is praying and a person who is an idolater is standing in front of you and is holding an idol, and the person praying got to the point where one needs to bow, one should not bow, because you wouldn't want to look like you were bowing over to an idol. So if the person in front of you is wearing, like a big, I don't know, something around their neck, or it looks like you might be bowing bowing to something that is not bowing to God, you would actually not bow for fear of looking like you were doing something idolatrous. The question comes up around bowing to the Torah, and we're very careful to say that it's not that we're actually bowing to the Torah. Rather, we're bowing towards the ark, and in most cases, in Beit Knesset, in synagogues, the ark is facing the east, and so the idea is that we're facing east towards Jerusalem, not that we're ever finding ourselves bowing towards an object, right? We don't want to ever be bowing towards an object in that way. Similarly, or I should say, maybe on the contrary, when the Torah is going around the room, we don't want to put our back to it, right? But we don't necessarily bow. You might see in some Persian communities in Los Angeles, we saw this a lot. People would put their hands like this towards the Torah when it would come by, kind of like an acknowledgement, but never any sort of bowing towards the Torah. So.
Can I ask a question with that? Because most of us will go and take our talit or a prayer book and touch the Torah when it comes by. But I see people who will not do that, and they tend to do a little bow. They stand back and they bow. So you're saying that's wrong?
Yeah. So what I read in these sources having to do with bowing is that you're not supposed to really ever bow to an object. And the kissing of the Torah, the whole point of bringing the Torah out is to bring the Torah into the community and to sort of let everybody have a piece of the Torah, if you will, like in their own hands, and put the Torah to your lips, not to treat it as if it is God, right? Not to bow to it in any sort of a way. So acknowledgement, but not bowing. All right. So minchag or halacha?
Both.
Sandra, why?
Probably what you said before, because there's interpretation with different communities. I would think it's minhag, like you said. The Persian communities go this way, and
That's
then maybe these explanations are attempts to make it halacha.
Great, exactly. So it's a halacha to bow, and it's a minhag, sort of how you do it, right? So it's clearly a halacha that you're supposed to bow in some way. And then it's a minhag from different communities and even from different rabbinic teachers here on how you actually do it. And which is quite fascinating, right? Because it feels when you're in your own community, at least, it feels like most people are doing the same thing, I think. And so clear, it has to be from somewhere. And then you kind of read through these sources and you say, actually, there's quite a bit of minhag, there's quite a bit of tradition that has influenced how we actually do these bows. All right, I'm going to move quickly and we're going to do our last section. I'll tell you.
The schedule said this goes to 9:15.
Oh, it's not.
No,
it's going till 9. It's going till 9. I think it said in the anyway. All right.
The scripture said 9. The schedule said 9:15.
Yeah, thank you. I thought so. Okay. Baruch. There is. I put this at the top. The Shulchan Aruch, no. Mishnah Berurah, no. Mishnah Torah, no. None of these halachic sources say anything about it, okay? The Baruch Hu is there as a call to prayer and as a way of introducing the Shema, right? That's not to say that it's not important, but if you study the Baruch Hu, you're studying it in a section of the Shema. So the My People's Prayer Book, which is where I'm about to get all this sources from, Shema and its blessings. And the Baruch Hu is the call to that section of prayer. And so if you look in the halachic sources, there's actually nothing about the Baruch Hu at all. And so you have a bunch of rabbis who are trying to figure this out. And I'm one of them, and now you're all with me. So Rabbi Elliot Dorff is the rabbi at the American Jewish University, one of my teachers. He says, more than just praise, Baruch Hu is an invitation to acknowledge or recognize God, derived originally. Hold on a second. Before I do this, I meant to do this. What are people used to? Do you use your knee? Do you bend your knees in the Baruch Hu, or do you not? Very quickly. Raise your hand if you bow your knees in the Baruch Hu. Okay. Raise your hand if you don't bow your knees in the Baruch Hu. Okay, great. If we had more time, I'd go around and ask you all why, but that's okay. So let's just read what Rabbi Dorff has to say. More than just praise, Baruch Hu is an invitation to acknowledge or recognize God, derived originally and perhaps from berech, knee, which we talked about before, since people in antiquity would drop to their knees before a monarch or acknowledge his or her sovereignty. Jewish sources also describe worship gestures like bowing, korim, and fully prostrating oneself, mishtachavim, but these are restricted to a few prayers to avoid the mistaken impression that we are bowing to an ark or the Torah within as an idol. We fully prostrate ourselves only on the high holidays when we reenact the ancient temple rite that emphasizes God's transcendent sovereignty. We bend the knee, korim, and bow, mishtachavim, at limited occasions in the daily service. So Rabbi Dorff isn't even particularly clear, right? He says it's possible that Baruch is leading us to believe that we are bending our knee because of berech, but also there's only a few occasions in our liturgy that causes us to do this, and Baruch Hu might not actually be one of them. I believe that Rabbi Dorff teaches actually that you do go with berech, that you do go with bending your knees on the word Baruch, same as before with the Amidah, Ata, Baruch Hu et over, and then being fully standing straight when you say the word Adonai. Marilyn.
Yeah, I realize I probably do on the first one, Baruch, but the problem with the bending knees is it's knee bend up, and when you Baruch Adonai, what I see a lot of times, I learned once that you don't bow on Adonai, so I make sure I'm up at that point.
That's right.
But I know that is not universal either.
Well, I think no. Well, standing for God's name, I would say, is universal in that is the intention. I'm not saying that everybody knows necessarily to do that. Now this group of 23 people knows to do it, so you're all going to be, stellar at your Baruch Hu bows. But it's all to say, I think, but the intention definitely is to be standing for God's name. Whether or not you bend your knees on Baruch Hu, I think, is the question. And you're saying it could actually vary from call and response, is what you're saying also.
Like what I say, like for Baruch Hu and Adonai, I probably do because I have the space to do it. But when I do the repeat, I don't because it's Baruch Adonai. So I got to go down so I kind of do a really quick like knee bend really quickly so I can get up by Adonai. That's right.
On the same page, Rabbi Daniel Landis says about the Baruch Hu, As the call to formal prayer, the Baruch Hu requires a minyan and is said standing. If there's no minyan, it's omitted. We know that. The prayer leader bows at the Baruch Hu and stands erect again at God's name. The congregation responds to the call to prayer, bowing at the first word and rising again at God's name. So again, doesn't say is it knees or not. He just says, but there is definitely some sort of bowing over in both of the cases, both the call and the response. Panine Halacha is an interesting case. Is an Orthodox rabbi who is in Israel and is quite respected in his work, and he is going to give us a little bit more information on this. So there are varying customs with regard to standing when responding to Kaddish and Baruch Hu. According to the minhag of most Sfardim, there is no need to stand up while answering matters of sanctity, but one who is already standing must remain standing. So he is actually saying that you might not even be standing for the Baruch Hu at all, right? For Dvar Sheba Kedushah, which is the Baruch Hu and Kedushah and the Amidah, we might not even be standing at all if you're Sephardi. Most Ashkenazim are accustomed to standing while responding to Kaddish or Baruch Hu, which are matters of sanctity. However, concerning the Baruch Hu, which requires a short answer, many Ashkenazim have the custom, if they are already sitting, such as for the Torah reading or before Mariv, they don't completely stand up. Rather, they only rise slightly from their chairs when responding. So this answers your question, Gary. And this is similar to when you're blessing for Birkat Hamazon. When the Chazan says the word Baruch Hu, he bows a bit. Okay, and when saying Hashem, he straightens his body, himself out. Regarding the congregation, there are different customs. There are those accustomed to bowing down completely, those who bow slightly, and those who don't bow at all. Every person should follow his family's minchag. There it is, okay? When people, and by family they mean congregation Beshalom. When people with different minchagim pray together, it is proper that everyone bows slightly. So you don't want to, it says somewhere else, I don't think I included it here, you don't want to look like you're specifically not bowing, right? You don't want to not bow at all, but you sort of want to follow what's happening in your congregation. And then this just a clarifying piece on the Shulchan Aruch that says there's no need to stand during the reading of the Torah. So you might think that if you are standing for the Baruch Hu, because the Aliyah blessing is the Baruch Hu, that you have to stand. And actually it's not necessary to stand when you're saying the Baruch Hu at the Torah. Or I should say, if you're watching somebody else, if you have an Aliyah to the Torah, of course you're standing. But if you're anyway, okay. So minchag or halacha.
There's also a thing.
Minhag,
yeah, Gary.
There's also a thing with the standing that Elliot Tucker quotes, which has to do with whether you're on a uniform floor. Like if you're on a cement and carpet floor, there are different reasons whether you stand or not. I don't remember what the explanation was.
There's also, if you're going to fully prostrate, you're not supposed to do it in certain places that are dirty. Like you put your head on the floor, put your knees on the floor, you're supposed to cover it, right? And not do it on cement or ground or gravel or things like that.
Just one more that may be a different question for another time, but some people in the Kaddish, they don't bow, but they stand. There's an Orthodox, I think, custom of standing at certain points in the Kaddish.
Yeah, so there's different customs depending on for which of the Kaddishes that you're talking about. There's also what I learned from Rabbi Dorf, and they kind of alluded to this in the last piece in the Panei Halacha is if you're in mourning and you're saying the Kaddish, you would rise. If you're already standing, which in the case of the end of the service, like Aleinu, you would remain standing because you wouldn't want to, it would be disrespectful to sit when other people have to stand to continue on with the mourner's Kaddish. But for something like Kaddish Shalem, which might not lead you to be standing, or you might not already be standing, you don't have to actually pull yourself out. You don't have to actually stand with the intention of standing for the Kaddish. But yeah. So I know this felt like it was on speed, but I thought it was really important to sort of take us through all of those sources. And maybe you have some clarity and maybe you just feel more confused than when you started. So I hope that we'll continue.
Can you share the short sheet in the
Sure, yeah.
Well, one of the ones where we show the most diversity when you're talking about standing and sitting is the Kaddish to start Musaf, where our congregation, I'd say, is 70-30 as to who stands and who doesn't for that.
Yeah, and I think the Kaddish before the Zod HaTorah as well, the Chatzi Kaddish in the Torah service, some people sit and some people stand. To me, both of those examples are perfect examples of a place where you would stand because you're about to anyway, right? So to me, that feels like a place that you would, but it's not halacha. It's not very clear.
And we always taught that since you're sitting before it, you don't get up for the thing. You continue sitting because you weren't standing already.
Right. That's what the Pinine Halacha was
Yeah.
saying, that you don't have to get up unless you're getting up to say the mourner's Kaddish yourself or something like that. Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we close? Yeah, Stuart.
I wonder with COVID whether some of these customs will change. For example, being prostrated on the floor, kissing the
Maybe.
Torah.
Right. I mean, so we've talked about some of these already, right? Like when during Tachanun, like you put your head down when you're in front of the ark, and now none of us are in front of an ark, right? So how do we actually translate that into our prayers today? But most of these instances that we're talking about, Aleinu, Baruchu, and Amidah, are not actually saying that you're bowing in the direction of the ark. It's more about the choreography of your body, but certainly the texts have what to say about that and the directionality and things like that. So I'll tell you that I'm always very conscious not to bow towards my computer. I find it to be strange. So when I'm doing an Amidah or an Aleinu, I always sort of turn to the side and I bow somewhere else. Maybe some of you have noticed that. It feels like I'm, and in our congregation, it can feel like you're, bowing at each other if you don't sort of turn. But I'm always very conscious with the computer to turn. Marcia.
What about the point at the end of the Kaddish, you say, "Oh, say shalom b'mromav, uya say shalom." I mean, that's the one that's sort of the most marked, where you sort of know you're supposed to be bowing.
Right. Yeah. It's not really written anywhere, though. I mean, they reference it a little bit here at the end. You saw where it says Baruchu and Kaddish. Pnei Halacha kind of puts them together as places that you bow. But the choreography it's interesting that you say that's the one place where I have, because I would actually say that I haven't seen so much writing about it, but definitely it's a custom. Yeah.
More so than the Baruchu, actually.
You think?
Yeah, I think that pretty much everybody know. If the minhag, I think it's people know, the step back, the step forward.
Yeah.
Whereas the Baruchu, I don't know that that's universally. Maybe it's because it's such a short amount of time.
Right.
Well,
I think, I think if we can take anything from sort of having gone through all these sources and asking questions and thinking about the different places, is not the question of should you bow, it's how you bow, right? And I think that the how is definitely left up for interpretation, but the when is less so. And so perhaps you learned the places in the Amidah to bow that you didn't know before, or the call and response of the Baruchu. But really, it seems like our tradition is coming to show us where we're supposed to bow, but not necessarily giving us a whole lot of guidance on how. So thanks for going through that with me, and I appreciate your questions. And we'll try it again next week with something new.